Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Van Weergen, and I'm the Marketing Director here at the International Institute for Analytics. Welcome to today's webinar, Analytics Maturity, Making Technology and Analysis Work Smarter. In case you are new to the International Institute for Analytics, also known as IIA, we are a research and advisory firm co-founded by Tom Davenport and our CEO, Jack Phillips. We work with companies to grow their analytics capabilities, improve performance, and get the most impact from data teams. This webinar is part of our ongoing webinar series that highlight important concepts, techniques, and strategies in the world of data and business analytics. Our clients rely on IIA to provide unbiased insights and a range of perspectives from a network of independent analytics experts and practitioners. So for more information on IIA, visit iiaanalytics.com. So we can get started, I'm delighted to welcome IIA's own Chief Analytics Officer, Bill Franks. He's going to be your host today. And then our speakers are IIA's VP, David Alice, and Alteryx's Director of Product, Nick Jewell. So Bill's focus has always been to translate complex analytics into terms that business users can understand, and will work with organizations to implement their analytics effectively. His work has spanned many industries, from companies ranging from Fortune 100 companies to small nonprofits. Bill, I'll let you take it from here.
All right, thanks a lot, Lindsay, and thanks everybody for joining today. I think you're in for a really good discussion. What I'll do is introduce our speakers and the content in a minute, but I also want to reinforce what Lindsay said, which is please feel free to submit your questions via the chat window. We will, to the extent possible, take a few questions as we go, and then at the back end of the session, obviously, we'll use the remaining time to follow up with questions. So as we start to get into the session, I'll just give you a little bit of background on who you're going to be primarily hearing from today. We're going to have two primary speakers. We've got David Alice. He's the Vice President with IIA who oversees the assessment research and services that we offer, which is what we'll be focused on today. He also has done a lot of writing on the topics about how technology trends in general influence the analytics space and how these maturity trends tie in with that. He's been with us at IIA for about 4 years now, and prior to that he held executive positions in companies in a couple of industries around electronic design automation, energy analytics, and cloud development platforms. So I think you're going to hear some good stuff from David with all of his background in this. We also have Nick Jewell from Alteryx. He's their Director of Product and Solutions Marketing. And in that role, he gets to work within the company's product management, sales, and customer service teams to help build that end-to-end platform vision for their customers. He also gets to be a product evangelist with the analytics and data science community, and part of that is how he ends up speaking with us today. So, Lindsay, if you flip to the agenda, what we're going to do, we've done webinars in the past, and many of you probably have been on those webinars about our analytics maturity framework and some of the benchmarking. We're going to spend just a little bit of time on that today to set the stage, refresh you if you've heard it before, and give you enough information on it if you haven't heard of it to know where we're heading. But then today's webinar is going to go somewhere a little bit deeper, which will focus on the common stages we see most companies in, stage 2 and stage 3. Stage 2 being more localized analytics where there's some pockets of success. You know, it's a big leap then to get up to stage 3 where there's really starting to be an enterprise view and support for analytics. And there are some tangible things you can do to navigate the gap between stage 2 and stage 3. And that's where David and Nick are really going to focus today. And I think you'll find it to be very valuable. So with that, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning, Bill. Thanks for the introduction. Nick, it's great to be here with you today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. You know, as we work with clients here in the States and around the world, we get a lot of questions around analytics maturity. You know, questions about how do you even define what analytics maturity is? How do you measure analytics maturity or capability across the enterprise? As a company or an enterprise, what can we do to advance our capabilities? And then companies are always interested about how they compare with other companies and with other industries. And when we talk about analytics maturity, when we measure analytics maturity, we really like to leverage 2 industry standard frameworks, and that is the 5 stages of analytics maturity and the Delta Plus model. Now, the 5 stages of analytics maturity was introduced by Tom Davenport and Jeannie Harris 10 years ago in the book Competing on Analytics. And it still does a really good job of characterizing different stages of maturity and how companies behave when they're in those stages. The first stage that they talk about is analytically impaired companies. Now, these companies are not data-driven. They typically still rely on gut-based decision-making when it comes to core decisions. They lack minimal capabilities with respect to data and analytics, and they often don't have leadership support to drive change. Stage 2 companies are companies that are mastering localized analytics. Here, analytics and reporting may exist in silos, but there's not an enterprise focus or a cross-functional focus with respect to analytics. And while they may have pockets of excellence with respect to capabilities, they'll have other portions of the enterprise that don't leverage analytics at all. Another key characteristic here is that where they do analytics, it's often applied inconsistently with respect to use case technology, et cetera. And they often are still struggling with core data issues. And from some of the data we collected and we'll talk about today, most companies are somewhere here in stage 2. Now, stage 3 companies are companies that have analytical aspirations. These companies have realized the value of analytics and how it can impact their enterprise and have started to organize to address consistent use of analytics across the company. And here they'll have a focus on things like process, culture, infrastructure to support that consistent use. And then you generally migrate into stage 4 and stage 5, and this is where the benefit of that enterprise approach to analytics comes into play. Stage 4 companies are companies that are analytical. They're highly data-oriented. They have sophisticated analytical tools in place, and they have broad coordination across the enterprise with respect to using analytics. And the data we've collected, most digital native companies like Google, Amazon, et cetera, are somewhere in stage 4. And then stage 5 really becomes that stage of analytical nirvana, where the company is using advanced analytics across all aspects of its business and is able to drive significant competitive advantage by using those analytics. And today, since most companies are in stage 2 and struggling to get effective implementation of stage 3, we're really going to focus on that stage 2 to stage 3 transition. Now, the other framework we use is the Delta Plus framework. This framework encompasses 5 foundational elements of a successful analytics program: data, enterprise, leadership, targets, and analysts or analytical talent. It also introduces 2 new elements, which are analytical techniques and technology. And the key thing here with this framework is these 7 elements have to be advanced in concert with each other since they're highly interrelated. If you look at data, data really is the foundation of any meaningful analytics. And for companies to become more analytically mature, that data must be organized, it must be integrated, it has to be accessible, and it has to be of high quality. Another key factor we're seeing more and more is to have differentiated data within the company that they can use for competitive advantage. Another key component is to have an enterprise approach to managing analytics. And here the key thing is that the enterprise looks at things like systems, data, and analytics talent and manages it for consistency across the enterprise. This usually requires having an analytics strategy or a program in place, a roadmap for how capabilities will be developed, and usually a specific plan for addressing culture. Leadership looked at the passion and commitment of the executive team and middle-level managers to use analytics, to advocate for the use of analytics, and to really collaborate around cross-functional use of analytics within the enterprise. Targets really looked at the process for determining which projects are worked on and how they're managed into production. And some key things here really to have a systematic way of capturing analytics opportunities and a consistent approach to prioritizing which opportunities get worked on as far as advancing analytics maturity. Now, analysts obviously is the need for analytical talent. This is a key foundational element. When you look at analytical talent, you not only have to look at your data scientists and your analytics professionals, but you have to look at anybody that might be making data-driven decision-making or doing data-driven decisioning, whether it be with spreadsheets or just ad hoc data collection. Another key thing is with respect to managing that talent is also have the proper mix of business expertise with analytical expertise. Now, when the Competing on Analytics was recently updated, the 10-year anniversary edition, 2 new elements were added. The first is analytical techniques, and this just really reflects some of the changes we're seeing in the marketplace with respect to cloud, open source, the general falling cost of compute and storage. And here organizations can go way beyond traditional analytical techniques with respect to what they apply. So this is looking at the ability to take techniques like AI and machine learning and put them into production, and also to be able to combine different types of techniques into ensemble models to solve different problems. And last but not least is technology. Here, this is really the organization's ability to deploy, manage, and implement the underlying infrastructure, tools, and technologies required for advanced analytics. Some key elements here are to have the ability to support experimentation, to have flexibility in your architectures, and really to be able to get features into production as quickly as possible. Other key elements here are just the ability to master things like on-premise implementations, cloud implementations, and some specialized hardware that use cases on the analytics side might have, for example, like GPUs or IoT infrastructure. So the key thing here is that you can use these frameworks to basically understand where companies are today and then to build strategies for advancing analytics maturity. Now, the one thing from our perspective about these frameworks is they're not just theoretical. We've developed a family of analytics maturity assessments that really leverage these frameworks and allow you to basically put them into production. And we've used this family of assessments to assess companies over the last 5 years. And we've also been actively collecting analytics maturity data with these same methodologies over the last 2 years. In whole, we've collected over 17,000 surveys from over 220 companies. And it really tells us that building these type of capabilities is difficult and that most companies are in that critical stage 2 to stage 3 transition. So if you kind of look at the distribution of analytics maturity across the different industries and from the data we've collected, from our estimation and from just the descriptions themselves, most companies are somewhere in stage 2, and you have a very long tail distribution into stage 3 and stage 4. Now, based on the over 80 full assessments that we've done over the last 5 years, we see a typical, similar type distribution, low score in low stage 1, a high score up in high stage 3, and the median basically being in stage 2. Now, the other thing we've done is done a lot of original research in this area. So using the same techniques and surveys that we've developed for our full assessments, we collect maturity data on an ongoing basis, and we compile that into what we call market leader indices. And these represent, best-in-class analytical performance across a variety of different industries. And using these techniques, we've collected data on over 140 companies, and you see the ranges here from high stage 1 to high stage 4. And really what we try to do with these is give companies an idea of what type of analytics maturity do I have to achieve in order to be competitive in a particular space. So the very high end of the analytical data we've collected, you can see companies that are the large digital native companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, et cetera. They're right in the middle of stage 4. We also look at digital native, segment-focused companies like Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, and they tend to be in low stage 4 with respect to overall analytics maturity. If you delve into some of the traditional industries, there's still a number of industries where even getting to be high stage 2 from an analytics maturity perspective can get you competitive advantage. Industries like healthcare provider, insurance, and specialty retail. And if you really look, there's a select number of industries that are high stage 3 with respect to the best-in-class performance. Again, not surprising, companies like financial services, consumer brands, big box general retail. And there's a number of other industries where low stage 3 would generally consider to be a competitive advantage within that space. And this follow-on slide just looks at some of the ranges and distributions within those spaces. So even where we've compiled an indice and we have a particular score, there's still generally a large range of scores within the leaders of a particular segment. Again, important to remember here that these are leadership type scores. Again, most companies across all these traditional industries would be somewhere in stage 2. But if you're in financial services, the gap is significantly larger to get to a competitive status versus maybe healthcare provider. And you also see you have certain industries like manufacturing with a broad range of scores. So Nick, at this point, I was curious to see what you think of this data and maybe what you're seeing in the market with respect to analytics maturity.
Yeah, thanks, David. Hi, everybody. So I just wanted to make a little call out, really, it's quite fascinating to me to see such a distribution of analytic maturity across all of these industries. And I think, over to the left-hand side with your axis, your y-axis, it's what makes it so critical to stay competitive in those markets. So that distinction on the y-axis, the maturity, really pulls out the haves versus the have-nots when it comes to analytics. I'll give you an example. Some of our leading customers, maybe in the quick service restaurant space, are actually doing some really innovative analytic work around location planning, even using some of those spatial elements to help push their tax analytics, where maybe restaurants are distributed over state or county lines. So for me, it's actually important to know which industries have work to do relative to others. That's your x-axis. But also companies need to take note of their position in their peer group as well. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And of course, the key thing here too is to drive that consistent use of analytics across all elements of the enterprise. And again, we'll see, even within companies, broad ranges of analytics maturity across different groups. And really getting those in alignment is ultimately what we want to drive to do. So that's a great example. So let's then dive in now that we've provided some overview and really talk about that stage 2 to stage 3 transition. So the data would indicate that most companies are in stage 2, and that if you can advance your company to mid or high stage 3, you're likely to see a competitive advantage within your space. So let's just really look about what a stage 2 company looks like and what a stage 3 company looks like, and how we could use the Delta Plus model to kind of map out a roadmap. So stage 2 companies are going to have some general descriptors, right? Analytics resources and activities are going to be largely departmental, functional, or process-based and siloed with respect to their implementation. Data will be largely local managed. There may be some advanced modeling and some established functions, but most of the analytics work is largely descriptive. Another key thing here is there's no effective enterprise analytics strategy for management of talent, technology, and targets. And the key thing I want to emphasize here is effective. You will do assessments on lots of companies that end up being in stage 2, but they'll say, hey, we have these programs in place, we've implemented these things. What you're really seeing here is the difference between theory and practice, and really getting effective implementation of these things is very difficult. You also see these companies have local analytics leaders, people that are really pushing for analytics within the business, but they tend to be really focused on local applications. And then analysts tend to be distributed unevenly across the enterprise, and they're not networked or working together in any collaborative fashion. And you'll see stage 3 companies will have some distinct differences. The first thing is that the enterprise is going to be well aware of the value of analytics. And they're going to be more focused on building systematic structures for implementing analytics and managing those resources. Data is likely to be managed in a much more cross-functional nature with the implementation of things like warehouses and data lakes. You also see analytics infrastructures coalescing around some key platforms and technologies. You'll see senior leaders actively recognize the importance of analytics capabilities and promote the expansion. And you also see projects that have a much more strategic or enterprise level of approach and value with respect to analytics. And finally, the most important thing is you'll see analytical talent be something that the business leaders recognize is important and that they're trying to manage at a company level. And here we're going to talk over the next several slides about the 7 different elements of the Delta Plus framework and how the stage 2 to stage 3 transition would work, and some initiatives and practices that you can put into place. So let's jump in and look at data. Stage 2 company, there's going to be lots of usable data throughout the company, but again, it's going to be isolated in functional or process silos. If you're in senior executive discussions, there's not going to be a lot of talk about data management or strategically leveraging analytics. And most of the tools in place are going to be BI tools or very basic analytics tools. Now, stage 3 companies are going to be in the process of basically identifying key domains and creating data warehouses and data lakes for accessing those domains. They'll also be expanding into unstructured data and putting that into practice. So you'll see much more sophisticated use of data in these companies. Now, some key actions that you can take to basically drive the transition from stage 2 to stage 3 include building enterprise consensus around analytical targets and their data needs, to really start justifying and building those domain data warehouses and the corresponding analytical expertise to use them. I think having that analytic expertise is a really critical factor. We're running lots of customers that have data warehouses or data lakes stood up, but they're very restricted in the use cases of the people that actually have access to them. So again, you have to push into that effectiveness and they actually get them implemented. Another key thing is to really,
Yeah, go after this thought. Go ahead and finish your thought here, but then I did have a couple questions come in that are relevant before you move past.
Okay, great. And then the final thing is really to motivate and reward cross-functional data contributions and management, across the enterprise. And really here, another key thing is just to discourage data hoarding. Another thing we'll see, especially at the middle management layer, is that access to unique data and understanding data within the infrastructure is one of the impediments to broader data-driven decision making. And with that, Bill, we can jump into some questions.
Yeah, I think one of them is a good one in terms of putting context. It's around when you're listing things like the traits of a stage 2. Are what you're listing considered the lower bound, the average, or or more the upper bound of what you'd expect within a stage 2 company?
I mean, I think it's descriptive in degrees, right? I mean, so for example, stage 2 companies still localized analytics. There can be a degree of how widespread analytics are if they still have a localized function. So certainly you're going to see, more usable data, more use of analytics as you advance in stage 2. Maybe you'll start to get, with select groups using more advanced tools, but it's definitely a kind of shading degree as you go through stage 2. And likewise, stage 3 is going to be shading from having plans and actually starting implementations to completing implementations and actually getting widespread use as you exit stage 3. I will say though, like with respect to data warehouse, data lake, broadly available data, you have to have that in place and broadly accessible to exit stage 3.
Okay, and then Todd, since we're on the data phase, someone asked about how you can ensure that senior leadership understands the type and quality of data that's available. There's a feeling that potentially within an analytics department, sometimes the information around the data is a little bit closely held, and it's hard for some of the rest of the organization to get the visibility to that.
I mean, yeah, I think there's not we'll talk a little bit about this in leadership, and if Nick has some ideas, he can certainly chime in. But I think there's no easy way to, change the culture, right? I think, and we'll talk about this a little later, but you really have to frame a bunch of different discussions about why analytics is important, what the impact can be. You get a couple of key executive sponsors that'll help drive that cultural change. But I think what you're alluding to there is really around the cultural aspects of data and making it more widely available. And the best thing there is you're going to have leaders that basically walk the walk, so to speak, with respect to using data and demanding that data is involved in the decision making. Yeah, no, Nick, if you have anything to add on those two items?
Yeah, I think in some ways it goes from the treatment of data itself to actually thinking about things like metadata, the attributes around the data. I'll talk about this in a couple of slides' time, but it's about surfacing that in a very, very collaborative, user-friendly way that everybody in the organization can have access to. So senior leaders get to understand their landscape at a glance. Analysts work out exactly what they need to start a project. I think that's kind of an essential step, going beyond just the transactional aspects of the data and moving towards more of that quality and use sort of applications.
Yeah, and there's one last one we'll take now, then I think we'll move on and we'll come back. But I think this question would apply probably to the slides that are upcoming, as well as we talk about some of the other aspects of the Delta model. But the question is it possible that within the same company, maybe the company overall is rated in stage 2? Is it possible to have some departments that are better or worse? So for example, maybe marketing's in stage 3 and operations is in stage 1.
That's it's very prevalent in stage 2 companies, right? I mean, when you have a stage 2 company, and we'll break down and look at, up to 10, 15, 20 different operational groups, there'll be wildly different numbers with respect to analytics maturity. And that can be both from a cultural, broader business stakeholder perspective, but also just in the technology that's deployed. And that's really the challenge again in stage 3 is how do I take varying degrees of analytics maturity and capability and get them baseline so everybody's using it in the same orientation. And so Nick, I don't know if you have some more thoughts around data, maybe what you're seeing in the market, what you're seeing with your clients.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me personally, I think this move from stage 2 to stage 3 really highlights some of the important practices around data and also the use of data for analytics. Now, at Alteryx, this is where we critically see an automated data catalog working really well alongside a well-curated business glossary, which kind of documents defined technology or terminology within the company. Now, your process here, once data sources get identified, they can be automatically tagged for their contents, maybe potential uses in the organization, as we just mentioned. And this has, I guess, the positive effect that more analysts will be able to find the asset, take a look, maybe start a conversation around that content, and then begin to incorporate this new source into a business process. Now, I really liked your points about building data warehouses, or I've often seen the term hydrating data lakes these days. It's always well worth investing in building a framework up front that helps business teams understand what could be built before you actually commit resources to actually start moving the data. Then once you get going, build incrementally based on those agreed conversations. And I think in my time, I've seen a bit too many white elephants in this area. So it really pays to stay flexible when business priorities do change. And then finally, I think it's valuable to introduce light touch governance between stage 2 and stage 3. This doesn't need to be anything more burdening than just the simplest of questions. So for example, what does the data or the asset mean to the business? Who can access the content? And then where can they find it? So the answers to these questions really sets you off on the right path. Now, David, if you just move on to the next slide, you can see the best practice that we've learned from our customers around making sure that all those assets from the disparate data sources are curated into a single location. And this really means everything from databases, data warehouses, to BI tools, and just about everything in between. Now, once you've uncovered all of this great content, you need the capability to build relationships between those assets. Like, for example, where does the data from this table end up in your final BI layer? And then finally, use crowdsourcing wherever possible to really augment those assets and surface the best ones to the widest possible audience.
Great. All right, so let's move on to the second element of the Delta Plus framework, which is enterprise, right? And again, enterprise is really having a broader kind of enterprise focus with respect to how analytics are managed. And a key part of this is actually scalability of that technology infrastructure, how the organization is set up, how broadly analytics are used. So in a stage 2 company, you're going to see islands of data and technology that are really focused on delivering local value. Now, stage 3 companies, you'll still have that process or business unit focus on analytics, but the infrastructure is a lot more consistent. Things like data management, data security are a lot more consistent. You're seeing that coalesce around a set of standards. So how do we make that transition? I mean, one thing is just being really savvy about selecting applications that are relevant to multiple business areas, but have a very manageable scope. So again, here we're trying to get projects that prove the success of analytics and build momentum around a program. Another thing that Nick just alluded to is to really start developing standards for data privacy and security, and then for building that analytical infrastructure on an incremental basis. And this is another key thing. You know, I think you want to avoid these moonshot large platforms that take years to put into place, just given the pace of development. You really want to adopt incremental improvements and flexibility as you roll out the scalability aspects of your enterprise strategy. And you really want to then plan and lay the groundwork for enterprise analytics strategy and priorities. Start investing the business stakeholders, all the analytics leaders, and really trying to build a strategy that can ultimately be implemented. Now, Nick, I'd love to get some of your perspectives on what you're seeing in the market with respect to enterprise strategies.
Yeah, I've got a couple of good tips here from personal experience. So as your organization starts to move into that stage 3 enterprise, I would always recommend building out straw man functional models of your business. And this is really to see where those analytic needs are currently met and unmet, or in particular, where duplication exists today. We'll touch on duplication more later on. And this is often because of all of those internal walls between departments. So I think we're going to touch on this subject about one phase of your organization being a bit further ahead of others and being able to drag other areas through to greater maturity. Now, it's unlikely that this model that you build is going to be perfect. I mean, which model is, but it's usually a great starting point to understand the landscape that you're going to need to transform. In fact, it actually always surprises me how few analytic teams bother to take the time to really understand their environment before they start to shape it with analytics. Now, you talk about infrastructure. We talk about infrastructure starting to coalesce in stage 3. I think this forms a natural co-evolution with the formation maybe of initial analytics centers of excellence, or COEs. If you jump over to the next slide, I'll take you through one of my favorite examples. Now, a few years back, a large oil and gas company saw a huge shift in the world of data, with technology becoming faster and cheaper year on year. So the cost of infrastructure was dropping rapidly, including everything from the cost of device sensors to bandwidth to processing power, and of course, a huge reduction in the cost of computing and storage, thanks to the cloud. Now, from these changes, a whole number of business opportunities started to emerge. So first of all, by sensorizing, I'm using air quotes, all of their assets, the company was able to measure a huge variety of data points and able to make data-driven decisions that just weren't possible beforehand. There was a huge pressure as well to start treating data as an asset, meaning that information was starting to become an internally marketable commodity, for want of a better word. And this opened up tremendous value across different divisions in the business. And then the growing need for ever faster data velocity. And this changed the way that the business treated and handled data as it got closer and closer to being available in real time. Now, the company used their own internally built analytics framework to help guide answers to questions like these in a structured way, and they started to map their emerging opportunities in order to manage them in a more systematic process. So the organization COE came about first and foremost as a means to showcase these new opportunities and really the art of the possible, but also to share best practice and to begin to foster an internal community. They realized pretty early on that no one team could do all of this by themselves as a monolithic group. So the COE worked really well as trusted advisors to the business, becoming champions with, in this case, the Alteryx platform, and enabling teams directly in the line of business to succeed. And, once a solution was ready, the COE helped steer it through to full production operation. And the COE also gets to steer the conversation around the future of analytics with the business too. So topics like computer vision or natural language processing or deep learning all get tracked as emerging capabilities, with the COE being tasked with demystifying, explaining, catalyzing these terms back to a pretty eager business. And then finally, the COE always thinking and learning about how to get its business audience to think about analytics in a more productive way. So this means bringing together a real spectrum of users. You've got on one end the skeptic who'd claim that this black box would never be as good as my top analyst, all the way through to, shall we say, the data enthusiast. And the data enthusiast might dive into some of these big data sources, finds maybe spurious correlations, patterns everywhere. We've all met somebody like that. So to bridge this gap, the COE also tries to develop enablement programs and builds a really active community to meet the demands of both its users and its innovation pipeline. And this could be everyone from a line of business analyst with Excel or business domain expertise, maybe through to software engineers who've got SQL or ETL or big data skills, and finally to data scientists working in R or Python. So the spectrum really needs to be that wide in order to be properly inclusive for this particular enterprise. With that, I'll hand back to you, David.
Those are great examples, Nick. So let's jump in here to leadership. So in a stage 2 company, you're going to see local leaders emerge from an analytics perspective, but they tend not to have much connection with each other. While a stage 3 company is going to have these senior leaders, both on the analytics side and on the business stakeholder side, recognize the importance of analytics capabilities. So that sounds like a pretty simple thing to do, right? I mean, the key thing here is just to create a vision of how analytics will be used in the organization and to begin to identify the specific capabilities that are necessary for that to happen. And of course, that sounds much simpler than it actually is with respect to practical implementation. So here, I think at least from my experience, and I'd love to get Nick's thoughts here in a second, but what we typically see is that just requires effort and a real focus on engaging with the business stakeholders. You've got to spend a lot of time educating managers and executives about how analytics can help them meet their performance objectives or help them with competitive challenges across the enterprises. You're going to need to get senior executives involved with identifying capabilities, finding cross-functional opportunities, and then really trying to set the analytical aspirations for the organization. And I think one key way to do this is to really identify those that are already inclined in that direction. And a lot of that's just involved in lots of active conversations, discussions, et cetera, to find those executives that can help you communicate the value across the enterprise. And then ultimately, you're going to have to get these people to work together and help build a roadmap for building out analytics capabilities on a data side, a technology side, a process side, and a talent side. One thing we've done here that's been helpful with some of our clients is just to share in greater detail some of the analytics maturity data. So it also helps to have people with a common framework about what analytics maturity is, and then some specific guideposts to target with respect to building those capabilities. And with that, Nick, I'd like to turn it back to you and get some of your thoughts about what you're seeing from a leadership perspective working with your clients.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I think to the questions earlier on, I mean, I see a lot of organizations really starting to build pressure to publicize analytics within the company. And this really comes down to the need to capture both, I guess, the formal and the informal value of the assets that get created in a regular business. So first of all, there's the logical top-down approach where maybe leaders acknowledge and certify that data or dashboards are correct, but also the reverse. And at Alteryx, we started calling this the TripAdvisor for analytics. And this is kind of where the larger population of knowledge workers, information workers can let others know what's been important to them. And in fact, we see companies around this stage 3 maturity starting to have those conversations about creating the role of chief data officer. And if we just move the slide forward, I can suggest some initial routes maybe to success for this particular group. We might call them immediate strategies, something to hit the ground running rather than maybe longer term plans. So 3 particular things to talk about. Step 1, start by asset scanning all of your internal networks and look for what we've called dark data. So what I mean by that is all of those duplicated spreadsheets, all of those other documents. Now, this is the first place that analyst time is wasted, trying to find the correct or the most recent copy of a valuable file. We've probably all been there. Step 2, make a review of all of your BI environments, and I guarantee there will be more than one of them. Now, often these BI environments can be virally successful, but very, very quickly they start to grow like weeds. Now, in this step, we're beginning to look for so-called gray data, and this might be where an enterprise dashboard should be fed from your corporate data warehouse, but actually it receives its data from local files that you found in step 1. And then finally, step 3, it's about understanding the duplication of effort inside your company. So get a feel for the number of headcount assigned to tasks like report building. Now, often this ends up being quite a little cottage industry and potentially can be fixed through self-service offerings. And as we say to all newly incumbent CDOs, you've got to make a financial case for change in your organization rather than a data quality one. So look for things like expense or risk as those critical factors. Back to you, David.
Yeah, Nick, I think those are great points and really highlight some of the interconnected nature of the different Delta elements. And with that, I think we should jump into targets.
Yeah, hey, David, real quick, this is Bill. Let me just toss one question out to you that came in. How would you prevent a COE from slowing response time down if you have a department that already has some rapid response teams and is maybe closer to stage 3? A COE can come in and add governance and other slowdown mechanisms that did not exist previously. How do you deal with that?
Nick, do you have any thoughts on that?
I've got one if you want a minute to think. So yeah. This is usually this maturity. There's lots of coevolution. So there's coevolution of practice. Think about the way we used to work on IT projects, which might have been a waterfall approach, taking months and months to get something over the line. We started moving towards agile. We moved towards DevOps as a way to continuously deliver. Your COE has to adopt the same kind of practices. We've got to be continuously changing. And if the COE shows signs of moving back to its comfort zone and its waterfall approach, we've got to nip that in the bud and move back towards more continual delivery. That'll keep the energy and the passion going across those teams. I've seen this in companies, and that's usually the best way to get started. Lots of regular communication and lots of very, very tight iterative cycles.
Yeah, I definitely agree with those points. So with that, I think let's transition to targets. And targets is really the process of identifying what projects are worked on and how they're prioritized and how they're managed into production. With stage 2 companies, you're going to have multiple disconnected targets, again, typically at that functional or siloed level. And you're really not going to see a lot of analytics initiatives that are at that strategic cross-functional level. Stage 3, that's going to be the big difference, right? You'll have analytical efforts coalescing behind a small set of strategically cross-functional important targets. And then how do we make this transition? Well, the first thing is really to work with the business areas that are already somewhat analytically inclined or that would greatly benefit from analytics. And that's just having a good command of the business and understanding how analytics would map into that. Another key thing is to target 1 or 2 cross-functional enterprise applications and really try to find a business stakeholder that will help sponsor. And again, I think a key thing here is not to overreach on this transition, right? The most important thing here is to have success and not to have an overly ambitious project or set of projects that ultimately fail. And the final thing is to really start developing systematic inventories of analytics opportunities in ways that they're going to be prioritized. And here, one of the things we're seeing when we work with our clients is that, especially as analytics use cases get more sophisticated and you're implementing things like machine learning, AI, or maybe streaming analytics, you have a much more sophisticated process that needs to be put in place for capturing user requirements. So we're seeing different types of customer engagement models deployed. From a software business or software industry perspective, it would look like product management skills, things like systems and tools that help prioritize analytics opportunities, and then different processes for engaging and working with customers, things like design thinking or UX design, or really embracing the iterative and customer engagement aspects of agile development. And this is an area where IIA has done a lot of coverage, both in research briefs and webinars, and we had a number of topics at our recent symposium where we covered these different areas. And with that, we'll jump ahead to the fifth element, which is analysts. And again, this is your analytical talent across the organization. I think if you look at a stage 2 company, you're going to see disconnected pockets of analytical talent, and there's really no central function or thought about managing those different skills, right? So the skills across the enterprise are largely unmanaged. Getting to stage 3, you're going to see that analytical talent recognized as a key strategic asset of the company, and you're going to see an effort at least to focus some of that resources on really important business areas. So how do we generate this transition? How do we make this happen? Well, the first is just to really identify the key analytical positions and roles that an organization needs to have, see where you have people that can fill those spots, but then ultimately start looking at ways to fill them. You also want to initiate a series of collaboration activities amongst the analytical talent pools within your organization. That can start with just exchanges of ideas and work. It can generally migrate into more expansive things like cross-functional and strategic initiatives. And then ultimately, you want to start building what we call career paths, right, which is to really provide a mechanism for the analytical talent in your organization to develop a specific career, to provide things like coaching and support, and also to ultimately build in a program of rotation so people are building up a diversity of analytical skills, but also a diversity of business skills and understanding. Nick, I don't know if you have some thoughts here to add about what you're seeing in the market about how companies are managing and deploying analytical talent.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, you and I have both been in this game for quite a while, but I still get pretty excited when companies change the way that they work with their analysts as they hit this stage 3. So, I mean, we start to see enablement often consisting of certification paths, and we always encourage analysts to really view these as genuine career changers. So you ask your staff to think about where the certification is going to take them, maybe on stage at an analytics conference being treated like rock star royalty. Hey, it happens. Thought leadership blogging, or maybe it's just the satisfaction of completing new challenges or mastering techniques. It really is all up for grabs. I'd also say that analysts really should take a look at for good programs, either locally or through their vendor networks. Now, typically, these programs are great opportunities to put analytic skills to work outside of the day job, and you get to come back maybe spiritually richer for the experience. Now, David, your point about rotation of analysts is really, really good, especially if the COE can take analysts on regular secondment. I mean, there is nothing like learning from the best, and it also keeps that COE fresh. So to the earlier point about the COE slowing down, having new analysts, fresh blood come in can be a real game changer. Speaking of that, if we can move the slides on, I'll give you an example. So Ford, probably typical of large, well-established companies that have used data analytics for decades. Maturity varying from department to department, as we've discussed. This often resulted in analytics expertise being located in pockets throughout the company, and maybe some inconsistent data management and data governance practice along with that. Now, when we surveyed them, they had over 4,600 different data sources. Maybe it's got higher, maybe it's got lower, but this is, just getting started on a new analytics project can be pretty hard going for an analyst. So Ford created the Global Data Insights and Analytics Unit, which was a centralized COE consisting of a team of data scientists and analysts organized to share best practices and then to spread these across the group. Now, the unit selected its best-in-class tools, not only based on capability, but also on their ability to integrate well together, with a real focus on democratization around reporting and also descriptive analytics, before moving on to more advanced areas. Now, democratization doesn't make somebody a data scientist, and the unit enabled team members to work with subject matter experts and receive training and get consistent methodology to work with their data. So a real world use case involved optimizing a logistics network, basically to discover if Ford were paying the right amount to move materials from point A to point B. So legacy analytics in place just didn't highlight actionable opportunities, and most of the complexity was still locked away inside analysts' heads. So the group had a huge breakthrough when the self-service optimization workflow was iterated between the business users and the analysts, who crucially were co-located. So they moved their analysis from a multi-year process to quarterly, and then got much of that process down to near real time. So an amazing scale of improvement. With this maturity in their analysis, and their analysts, the impact of self-service on the business value has really been that Ford can quickly plan and then establish corporate-wide data-driven strategies, but also responding to emerging trends, help shape their services, head off competitive threats without having to wait months to turn those analyses around. Back to you, David.
There's another great example. Let's jump ahead here to the sixth component, which is analytical techniques. And from a descriptive perspective, this is pretty straightforward. I mean, stage 2 companies are going to be deploying more basic analytical techniques, things like correlation, linear regression, often deploying them in maybe a batch type environment, right, where they're doing analysis on things that have already happened. Stage 3 companies are going to transition into more advanced techniques. You'll see predictive analytics into production. Do things like classification and dynamic forecasts. Now, how do you build these capabilities? Again, there's another great opportunity to leverage something like a center of excellence where you're building some competencies in predictive and prescriptive models. Certainly leveraging some of the newer technologies and to begin to build capabilities and things like machine learning are important. Undertaking some specific test and learn experiments. So sometimes it's great to have projects that are really designed to build the capability of the analytics organization and have value in that, and don't necessarily translate directly, at least immediately, into a specific business target. And then to try out things like text and sentiment analysis, again, more advanced techniques where you need to build capabilities. Again, here is really building these capabilities and not only having the ability to do it theoretically, but to get it put into practice and get it put in production within an organization. And Nick, I know you've got a great example here, so I'll hand it back to you to talk about how some of these changes happen.
Yeah, no problem. Before I get to that, I think it was Jeff Bezos at Amazon said, it's not an experiment if you know it's going to work. So you will fail, and you have to fail in order to learn as part of those actions. I'll just add that I think there's often a perceived tension between maybe code-free and code-friendly ways to achieve analytic results, but there really doesn't have to be any tension at all. And in fact, I think both have a part to play in offering improvements, not only in accuracy, but business efficiency as well in the right circumstances. And also, introducing predictive analytics doesn't just have to be about creating a production-ready model. And in fact, there are really some important insights from the modeling process itself that are really hugely valuable, like working out which model features are actually driving business outcomes. And in fact, this type of introspection often changes the way that predictive analytics get perceived in a maturing business as they hit stage 3. If you jump ahead to the next slide, we'll take a look at our final case study for today. Southwest Airlines, largest US domestic carrier, an enormous Boeing fleet. As you'd expect, they use data for almost every decision, from ticketing to logistics to meals on board their planes. Now, they had a particular challenge around optimizing fuel consumption. It basically accounted for around 27% of their operating expenses. Now, this calculation was taking around 3 days every single month, and it involved multiple data sources, multiple back-end systems, and the result, I kid you not, was 150 tabs spreadsheet with multiple calculation steps along the way. And this only allowed them to see the upcoming month's predictions. And we had great success in enabling Southwest to bring together their analysts and their data science teams, allowing line of business staff to start using repeatable processes, along with some pretty cutting edge R-based forecasting that could then be embedded back inside self-service workflows. The upshot, basically, a huge 70% increase in predicting fuel forecasting accuracy and a repeatable 12-month forecasting horizon, rather than just that single month that they were getting from Excel, built in a fraction of the time, code-free and code-friendly techniques together in a single analytic process. Pretty nice, huh?
Yeah, that's a great example. Of course, it's also a good segue into the technology discussion, which is our final delta element. So again, if you look at a stage 2 company, what you typically see on the technology side are analytics initiatives, again, at that local level, basic statistical packages. And of course, one thing we definitely see in a lot of stage 2 companies is widespread use of Excel as an analytical tool and environment. As you migrate into stage 3, you see an enterprise approach, and maybe it's not fully implemented, but at least an enterprise approach for how tools and platforms will ultimately be managed within an organization, and maybe a plan ultimately roll those out. And you also see more advanced analytical packages being put into place. I think the key here is actually, again, the nuts and bolts of actually managing this into production. Another good use of a center of excellence might be in identifying what suite of analytics tools should be used throughout the enterprise, and making sure that that suite of tools or the approach that's used actually has the flexibility to account for things that are likely to change. I think it's also important in this area to experiment with cloud-based analytics and data management, and to start looking at some big data applications and building capabilities in developing those applications. Again, the other thing I think with technology is just that more than anything, it really shows how analytics maturity is a moving target. When we started doing assessment back in 2014, you would never really talk about AI and machine learning as being something that an organization would need to develop in order to advance analytics maturity. You fast forward to today, and it's widespread where that's changing the environment upon which people are competing. So that type of disruption is real. It's very difficult to account for that if you don't have a flexible architecture and you're planning on a 5-year horizon. You need to be much more flexible and agile moving forward. And with that, Nick, I'd love to get some of your thoughts on the technology side and what you're seeing on the market.
Yeah, no problem. I'll keep it quick so we can get to the Q&A. What I usually find is the move between stages 2 and 3 kind of requires a little oiling of the analytic pipeline. I think there's usually some sort of siloed processes, maybe that acquire or transform data before it gets turned into insight, and we need to make that process a little smoother. So if you jump ahead one slide, we often describe this using the hourglass that you see here. So maybe at the bottom, we find databases or file stores or other mechanisms acting as the persistence layer for data. And at the top, we might have BI tools or other ways to consume the insights in that consumption layer. And in this middle part of the stack, we find a huge amount of fragmentation and friction. So you can see the kinds of processes that we're talking about. Everything from extraction, transformation, loading of raw data, to data quality, data integration, and then processing of that data ready for more advanced analytics. And then, of course, getting those resulting insights into the hands of decision makers. So we certainly see every customer having unique challenges in many of these layers, but there's nearly always a route to simplification to help resolve these analytic choke points. Maybe it's reducing the number of tools or the number of handoff steps, ultimately reducing the cost of ownership for that maturing analytics ecosystem. And I think you highlight many of these observations from the Delta survey, right, David?
Yes, I mean, we definitely will see that as we do assessments in the marketplace. And again, I think and Nick, I'd be curious to see what you see in the market as far as where companies struggle from a capability perspective as they try to get more advanced on an analytics in their analytics technology stack.
I think it often comes down to how well they've harmonized that stack. So it's about, I think with the the Ford example, with the oil and gas example, you've got to make sure that these components play nicely together. So if you're going into the cloud, you want to make sure you can deploy your persistence layer, your consumption layer, and your analytics layer all in that same environment. You don't want to have to be moving data unnecessarily. It's just additional cognitive load for the analysts.
Very helpful. So let's quickly wrap up with some observations and lessons learned, I think, both from this discussion and what we see when we're working with client organizations. I mean, number one, and the Delta framework is a great way to capture this, is that every company has unique barriers to analytics maturity. So we would work, and we've worked with 2 companies that would be stage 2 companies, but have dramatically different areas with which they need to focus in order to advance analytics maturity. So really understanding your organization and understanding the different elements that need to work together are really critical. As we talked about too, this is one of the questions, there's definitely going to be large differences in analytics maturities within organizations. So one of the key things is to try to balance those out, but to also leverage your high-performing groups to help enable the low-performing groups and move them forward. Another key thing, and we've certainly addressed this with the technology discussion, is that companies are still struggling with fundamental data issues. And again, there's no easy solution to this other than to make sure that you actually put in the effort and the work that's required to address those. It's very critical to have data well organized and usable before you advance into out of stage 2 and certainly into the higher levels of stage 3. Another key element is, again, recognizing it's different, but companies struggle to get analytics into production, right? To the place where the business stakeholders or the business customers of the organization are actually using analytics. And really focus on that and make sure you have good metrics about actual usage of these analytics in production. Another key thing when you try to advance through stage 2 to stage 3 is there's likely going to be a leadership or management issue that needs to be addressed, whether that's getting more executive advocacy for the use of analytics or actually maybe addressing some of the data economy that exists at the middle management layer. But again, as you make this transition, thinking about these 5 things is very important. Also, if you're interested in this content, we have some free resources available on our website. We also have a scoring tool that you can answer a couple questions and see how your organization might compare to other companies within your industry and against digital native companies. So I encourage everybody to take a look at those materials. And with that, we've got a couple minutes here for some questions, if there's some out there.
Yeah, David, 1 or 2 quick ones. One thing that I'm sure is on a lot of people's mind: how does AI factor into analytics maturity as it exists today?
Nick, do you have some thoughts on this, or do you want me to take a crack?
Well, I think AI really comes down to, replacing those low-hanging human-driven processes of today. So we see it a lot in things like RPA or robotic process automation, and we're starting to see many of the analytic features that we've talked about in that stack starting to appear within that world. So, you've got the ability to make decisions without human intervention, and that means that the previous operator can go on and do higher value work outside of that process. So I think it's natural we'll start to see more advanced analytics and more human equivalent capabilities start to be introduced into the processes. But I'd say, maybe you would think this is more of a stage 3 to 4 conversation rather than a 2 to 3?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would agree with that, especially with respect to getting them into production. I think the only other thing I think, AI and machine learning represent somewhat of a transition in skills, right? I mean, I do think you have to be able to leverage services, and it puts a much higher premium on leverage external services for things like AI and machine learning, that the cloud providers are doing. It also puts a higher premium on having, proprietary data. And really it marks some of the shift between algorithmic expertise and then having, proprietary data expertise as far as driving competitive advantage.
Yeah, thanks. And I know there's still some really good questions coming in. As always, we end up running out of time before we can address them all. But I wanted to, Nick and David, thank you very much for an informative session. Thank you for being flexible and taking some questions as we went. So hopefully people found both your planned content and the interaction to be valuable. This webinar, Lindsay's going to come back on here and tell you where you can get the recording and slides, as well as some upcoming events. So Lindsay, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Bill. And yeah, thank you, Nick and David, so much today. Great content. And thank you, everyone who joined the call. You guys asked some fantastic questions. So thank you again to Nick, David, and Bill, everyone who joined us. Have a great rest of your day, and make sure you're following IIA Social to see other upcoming webinars.